There's a common culture in Extremadura, both sides of the border. The Knights Templar always used to be in control of the region, keeping the peace. I don't know if you should say that Napoleon invaded Spain, but I think Napoleon definitely invaded Portugal. And in doing so, enabled Brazilian independence. Yay, cool! I think that's what we all want. And that's what we generally associate with Napoleon, that he used some of the age-old methods of the day, but he did a lot of... Good. He was much better than the Romans, anyway. Who were perhaps the last time that Europe was united. Napoleon properly dragged Europe out of the Middle Ages, and Portugal is perhaps quite a good example. No, Napoleon made a peace treaty with Spain, but it turns out it's one of those peace in our time type peace treaties that doesn't mean a thing. Napoleon liked those, especially in his peninsular campaign. You know, a coalition, that's not the same thing as a peace at all. France made a coalition with Portugal and Spain, but Spain made a peace with France. Portugal didn't. Perhaps they should have made a peace with Napoleon. He was pretty much after humiliation by any means. Napoleon has already sent a fairly large number of rather amateur French soldiers from different parts of his new empire, northern Germany particularly, all dressed and looking the part, and they've recruited from their allies much better Spanish soldiers to fight the Portuguese, who are blatantly trading with the British, and the British who... if they're not already, are certainly going to be enemies in the future. You know what coalitions are like. So the Spanish king, they were friends, but then they weren't friends, and the Spanish king was arrested. Now, the Spanish queen, the French escorted to just over the border of Spain into a nice coastal town in France, on the Mediterranean. I don't think Napoleon himself was planning on making the most of this abduction. Perhaps the popular uprising objections were directed at lesser ranks and their ambitions. The Spanish island of Minorca, British imagined, was theirs, having had it for a century and taking it back off the French. War of the Oranges between Portugal and Spain was a bit half-hearted, really. Not as interesting as slicing an orange and squeezing it so that it looks like it's talking. But half-hearted on two continents, Europe and South America. But Napoleon walks into Spain with tens of thousands of people dressed up in soldiers' uniforms, and the War of the Oranges gets pumped up like it's on energy drinks. No, this was Napoleon against the rest of the civilised world. But he wasn't daft. He made a peace treaty between Spain and Portugal and allowed the Spanish a little concession, Olivenza, a little town with a Moorish castle. The Arabs picked some good spots in Extremadura, just on the border really. This is why I was talking about Euro regions, borderlands. Petty little nagging conflicts from the time of the Crusades. The Knights Templar didn't really have much cause to... What's a Euro region? Well, no one knows really. It's lots of different things. It's a transnational cooperation agreement. You could almost say it's a really boring solution to a possibility of conflict. With so much hostilities in the world, a bit of boring would be good, wouldn't it? Perhaps Israel-Palestine could be a Euro region. A social and economic identity of a region, historical region really, that borders more than one country and often includes very close police cooperation. One country policing another's citizens. And the Israel-Palestine conflict is basically about how Israel can't accommodate a tunnel between Gaza and the West Bank and have its own land crossing over it. There's an alpine Euro region, there's a Arctic Euro region. There's lots of them, but one dates back to 1200, on the border between Portugal and Spain. The small border region is near Alcantara, Badajoz, and that other great European, Napoleon, had sort of solved it for a little while, somewhere around the year 1800. Go there. Oh no, the Treaty of Badajoz. There were two separate ones with Spain and... There was another Bonaparte, younger brother Lucien, who was live in situ, granting France substantial territorial gains in South America. The modern border between French Guiana and Brazil is Ionosphere River, which was agreed 100 years previously, the Iogani River and the Amapa River was where the French Guiana border was moved to, taking large parts of northern Brazil for France. But perhaps more importantly, Portugal also agreed to close its ports to British shipping, pay an indemnity of 20 million francs, and allow the import of French woolens, instead of British wool products. So you'd have thought baby Bonaparte had done quite well there, but Napoleon refused to ratify the treaty, claiming Little Bro and the foreign minister had been bribed by those darned Portuguese and their Brazilian gold, which happened. But the British just took the island of Madeira and then corralled and redirected to Britain any Portuguese convoys until, strange thing, that peace broke out for a couple of years. But France and Spain were soon at Britain again. Portuguese remaining neutral because they did a lot of trade with Britain, and there was that lucrative transatlantic misery to consider. Optimistically, getting ahead of themselves, Spain and France divided up Portugal between them at a fancy chateau outside of Paris, Treaty of Fontainebleau. This is all happening in the first decade of 1800, but in the first decade of 2000, Portuguese members of the European Parliament were making sure that this whole Extremadura region that's disputed, because of forgotten clauses of treaties, is designated as a Euro region. Extreme Alentejo, the Treaty of Badajoz from the 1200s perhaps seemed more relevant. Napoleon hasn't invaded Portugal at this point, he's just threatened it, and they're all making conclusions because it's little. Napoleon's threats were supposed to get Portugal to roll over and it to become a political and economic extension of France, empire and all. Now, all of this was helped by Godoy, a French romancer of the wife of the Prince and then King of Spain. She'd got her husband to promote her lover, who then through his guile made them pliable, ingratiated himself, and they weakened. Godoy became Prime Minister. He tried to save the French King Louis XVI from the guillotine, but failed. This was a time where war involved a lot of working class deaths because of deceptions of connected people that were supposed to be allies, but never really were intended to be. Destruction of the Spanish navy on France's behalf, the Battle of Trafalgar, was before Fontainebleau. Napoleon wanted to get his hands on the Portuguese fleet and their gold. France was planning on grabbing most of the northern coast of Spain to become France. So a government in exile in Rome was the best option. Godoy, until 50 years later, got a pension from France and was able to live in Paris, but 50 years later Isabella of Spain gave him a load of titles back. Godoy was periodically a bit of a double agent, and Juno seems to have been the major player in the whole of the Iberian Peninsula with 20 or 30,000 badly trained soldiers, and the advantage of a lot of others' political manoeuvrings and subterfuge behind him. A bit like Second World War Vichy France, the French controlled the Spanish military. The French marched off through Spain, amassing troops as they went. The Spanish roads were bad enough, but when they came to Portugal, they turned into donkey tracks. All Junot artillery sort of really had to be left behind. Huge numbers of his troops were always marauding for supplies, and they didn't exactly make themselves popular with the locals, and had to fight a fair amount of guerrilla warfare. But they made it to the liquid riches of Porto in the north, where they kept their trouble-free camp eventually. But Junot had had to really make a beeline. He'd had orders straight from Napoleon, what you hanging around about? So first they left the cannon behind in what are really quite small mountains, in inland Portugal, but boulder country and inaccessible all the same. Then their small cavalry didn't have any horses left. I don't know if they'd eaten them all, I suspect. But they entered and took Lisbon pretty much unopposed, and took all the locals' horses, and the cavalry were cavalry again. But Junot was a little bit too late. The royal family, the Braganças, much of the royal court, and the vast wealth of the country was on a flotilla of ships to Brazil, across the transatlantic to South America. The Portuguese fleet had left the Tagus River, been helped by the British, but had been in such a hurry that several cartloads of gold of the country's treasury had been left on the quayside. Goes the story. Whether that was paying the British off is a possibility, because when the French arrived, they ravaged the town for wealth, taxed them to the hilt, the local people, and there was nothing to be had. They were killing off the local population left, right and centre, but they just didn't have anything gold. So the Portuguese Braganza king controlled his own exile, really, in his best colony, better than his home country, and not ended up like the Spanish. Junot's French looting didn't last all that long, though. There was this chap that became the Duke of Wellington, and just 13,500 troops, and a lot more local poor recruits. Gave Junot right rollicking, and after the convention of Sintra, you've probably been there on holiday. Junot, the Frenchman, was allowed to evacuate Portugal with his army. A strong recruiting tool that the British had was that the French was using the Roman technique of people from one end of the empire to fight people from the other end of the empire. The Portuguese and Spanish that wanted to were sent to Germany to fight and extend that empire, particularly into Russia, and the Germans were fighting for the French in Portugal. But there were also a lot of Arab-looking French soldiers with scimitar-like swords, and for the Portuguese this was much too like the Moors were re-invading. An interesting and troubling few years, but I think it could be said Napoleon I was always overstretching himself, but with huge potential rewards. If Junot had managed to capture that Braganza king, or the country's wealth that came from Brazil, perhaps if he'd had railways or even halfway decent roads, he might have been able to rely on more than just neighbour. Always seemed to want to fight neighbour. If he'd have managed to capture the Portuguese fleet that was able to maintain a large empire, Napoleon's ambitions really could have become quite far-flung. But as it was, Portugal, the Iberian campaign, was a bit of a flash in the pan, but mostly important for Brazilian independence. A strange first type of independence where the king's son, appointed by the king when it felt that it was safe returning to Portugal after the British had won properly over Napoleon and France as a whole. There's then an episode where his wife wants the second son to rule Portugal, with the first son ruling Brazil, but the king wants his daughter to marry her uncle, and the uncle to take the throne. But the uncle's not that bothered about the idea and likes it for himself. But that's a story for another time, or depending on how I loaded it, it might be you've already seen that. Please do like and subscribe. Water filtration, tissue